Summer of 1914. Europe is at its peak. The wealthiest, most educated, most interconnected region in human history. 43 years without a major war. Trade at record highs. The future looks bright. If you opened a newspaper that July in Paris, Berlin, or London, the headlines seemed to be saying the same thing. Crisis, tension, mobilization. The words kept coming back, day after day. Most people read them and moved on. It felt like another political dispute. 6 weeks later, the continent descends into war. Newspapers didn't cause the war. The question is whether they saw it coming, and if so, how. Historians had noticed the pattern for years. In the weeks before major conflicts, newspapers often became filled with reports of crises and diplomatic disputes. The problem was that nobody had measured it systematically. Then Thomas Chadfosk decided to find out whether the pattern was real. He took 100 years of newspapers from 166 countries, millions of articles, multiple languages, and he asked a question that sounds simple but had never been answered systematically. Does the information environment change before a war in a way you can measure? The pattern turned out to be real. And it wasn't limited to a single war or a single country. Rather than analyzing specific events, Chadfosk looked at the language itself. His algorithm tracked the prevalence of words associated with conflict, crisis, and military action, and how their usage changed over months and years. Then he lined up the data against what actually happened. The results are extraordinary. His model identified major wars with 85% accuracy. For international conflicts, the signal appeared roughly 12 months before the first shot. For civil wars, about 6 months. Almost 70% of 20th century wars left a measurable trace in the public record long before they began. Now, let me clarify that. The newspapers were not predicting the future. They were capturing what people were paying attention to, worrying about, and talking about. As society changed, the language of the news changed with it. No one has to coordinate it. It happens through a chain of ordinary decisions. When people become more concerned about threats, even slightly, their attention shifts. They pay more attention to conflict, security, and international crises. Journalists respond to that demand by covering those topics more often. As coverage increases, those concerns become even more prominent in public discussion. Let me show you how this looks in practice. Yugoslavia, 1990. Serbian and Croatian newspapers begin to inhabit separate realities. Not suddenly, gradually. Grievances, accusations, and historical disputes become more common. By the time political negotiations collapse, the information space has already fractured. Rwanda, 1993. Kangura magazine and Radio Mille Collines used increasingly hostile and dehumanizing language. Researchers can trace that shift directly in the content itself. The vocabulary changed, the tone changed, and calls for violence became more common. By April 1994, Rwanda was in the middle of a genocide that would kill roughly 800,000 people. Iraq, 2002. American and British newspapers begin to change their tone. Uncertainty gives way to confidence. 12 months later, the invasion begins. Across all of these cases, the pattern was similar. The language changed before the events reached their breaking point. The news was reflecting a society under increasing strain. But what exactly are we looking at? Many of these signals are visible to anyone willing to look for them. Imagine two communities describing the same event. One describes it as peaceful citizens demanding what's rightfully theirs. The other calls it a mob. They've always been like this. Social psychologist Anne Mass found this pattern in everyday language. When our group does something positive, we tend to see it as part of our character. When our group does something negative, we explain it through circumstances. For other groups, we often do the reverse. Positive actions become exceptions. Negative actions become evidence of who they are. This is called linguistic intergroup bias. And as tensions rise, it tends to get stronger. Now imagine a popular radio host with a massive audience. Tensions with a neighboring community are already high. Day after day, he repeats the same message. They're taking your land. They're taking your future. What would a real man do to protect his family? He never explicitly calls for violence, but the implication becomes increasingly difficult to miss. Susan Benisht found that mass violence is rarely driven by one thing alone. Several conditions usually have to come together. A trusted speaker, an audience that already feels threatened, a message that hints at violence without stating it directly, a history of violence, and a platform that reaches millions. When these conditions align, the risk rises sharply. The third tool tracks dehumanization. Researchers have identified 3 common forms. People can be described as animals, pests, parasites, vermin. They can be reduced to objects or resources, treated as interchangeable and expendable. Or they can be portrayed as fundamentally evil, corrupting everyone around them. Each has its own pattern. Algorithms can track them at scale. But once you know the categories, you start noticing them on your own. A growing bias, a dangerous combination of conditions, increasing dehumanization. None guarantees violence, but together, they can reveal when a society is moving in a dangerous direction. When you read the news or scroll through your feed, pay attention to more than the events themselves. Pay attention to the language, who gets understanding and who gets blame, who is speaking and who is listening, and whether people are still being described as human beings. Once you know the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. And when you catch yourself thinking, they're all the same, it's worth asking where that conclusion came from. The information is available to anyone who looks for it. The question is whether we notice them in time.